Welcome to this week's Office Hours. Diving into some fun stuff today. We wrote a blog post, which we're doing weekly now, which is really fun. Kind of getting back into my writing habit, which I used to do kind of for funsies and kind of got away from it, just being busy and stuff. But it's been nice kind of taking what I usually geek out with on podcasts and stuff and writing it out, because there's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of things that we just talk about all the time that are very important that everybody needs to be aware of, and there's always new sellers and stuff. And so we actually ran a survey asking our users, what's the thing that you struggle with the most as a seller? And like 60 to 70% said price tanking. Like, all right, cool, let's talk about that. So from your perspective in support, how often are you seeing cases where essentially like that's what's happening and users are just like, what do I do?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely one of the more frequent topics of conversation in support and success, trying to find a way, like, how do I, whether it's get the buy box or get more sales in general without tanking that price? That's where it's like just not an exact science right now. Amazon does kind of take into account a few different things when determining that buy box winner, but price is definitely one of them. So always interested to, dive deep into people's strategies, see how we can maybe tweak things and see how those generally maybe improve that performance. But yeah, price tanking is going to be something that just happens on some listings. If a lot of your competitors are using repricers and they're not set to match your price, they're set to cut below, that's where you do usually get caught in a race to the bottom. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today, see how we can kind of look at that from a couple different angles.
Yeah, it's when I first got started as a seller, it's like the first thing you hear, the first term you learn outside of FBA, obviously, is price tanking. You're right. Or what I think is less common actually now that I think about it is penny chasing or penny chaser. You're being a penny chaser. Mm-hmm. And it made a lot of sense when I first got started as a seller, because you're like, yeah, that's horrible. Why would you do that? And then you become a seller long enough and you realize it's just part of the game to a certain degree. And the analogy I like to go with is steroids in sports. You could be, hardcore on principles against the concept and be like, I'm not going to do that. That's fine. Your choice. But you get to a critical mass of people who will and are like, I'll do that to win because I'm here to win. Now it's either don't compete or jump on board, right? And that's kind of how it feels a lot of times. It's like you don't really have much of a choice, right? You're just like, it's happening. What do I do? But this is something we learned when we first launched Aura, which was this oscillation strategy, which we talked a lot about last week. Sometimes there's actually strategy behind doing that, pushing the price down a little bit. I think people tend to push the price down way too much, like $5, when actually you could get good performance just pushing it down like 50 cents, maybe $1, and then pushing it back up and riding that wave. We talk about this wave in an oscillation. You really don't want it to be super up and down. You really want to be kind of tight. That seems to do well, but then it comes down to how do you avoid that, right? Because the oscillation strategy is really good. We talk about that, but it's not the end all be all, and it doesn't really like solve the problem overall. And this is something like with Maven, we really started to think about. And so we wrote a blog post, and I'll share it here. Cause I think it's pretty important. I'm just going to share the address bar here, or the address here. There you go. Yeah. So how to avoid price tanking. In it, I kind of break down how to think about this, because I think perspective here does matter. And the first section here is actually talking about seller psychology. It's like, every seller you're competing against essentially is in a different timeline of a life cycle, meaning every seller, when you first come into stock, you're very conservative on your pricing, right? You're maximizing your profitability. But as time goes on, the opportunity cost increases, long-term storage fees increase. And so it becomes important for you to eventually, if you hold it too long, sell it lower to get your capital back. So a lot of times when things are tanking, it's actually for the right reasons, just not for you, right? Not for everyone else. And I listen, I've had to do this before myself, where I'm like, oh, it's just not moving. I'm going to have to lower it. Like, I'm sorry. Like, there, my capital matters to me, and like, we're not colluding here, right? So I'm gonna do what's best for my business. And I think that's important. So as you're jumping on, you kind of have to assess how long has that seller been in stock? Because if they're going to push it out to get push the price down to get out, it's probably worth you holding up high. Actually, I used to do this with wholesale. if I knew that they had 20 units and I knew, 20 units could move if they had 100% of the buy box in 2 days, I've got 500 units. I'm honestly just going to let you have it and be like, good, like clear the market out of excess supply. Then when that changes, the buy box comes back up to me. And now I am the supply, right? I get to basically, I'm trading 2 days of demand for 3 months of demand.
Right.
And so you kind of have to think more strategically. When people are like, oh, it's a horrible idea, I'm like, in what way are we talking, right? There are so many nuances here. So we talk about that. We talk about in this, how this blog post, how we essentially design Maven to avoid these things and kind of be a little bit more strategic in avoiding these things. Sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't, right? And so kind of understanding, you can essentially watch a user's behavior and know and predict what they're going to do, right? It's pretty straightforward, especially if they're using a repricing tool that's very like rule based, which it's like it's always going to perform this way in these scenarios. So you can basically just say, cool, I know what your repricing strategy is now. I'm just going to use that against you. Or just know like, cool, they're pushing it down. I'm going to play a different game and kind of change. Like role-based is very reactive, right? So what happens if I'm causing the reaction from them and I change my behavior, their reaction also changes. And so we can kind of use that to our benefit. And like on this blog post, we actually have like, we took a screenshot of a Twitter post. Somebody was basically talking about how like Aura using Maven jumped from $63.84, he got a sale, to $90 and got a sale there, like 20, 30 minutes. What does he say? It was not far after, but basically like raising the buy box by 30% or $30. And so like, if you're being strategic, and this is why we really wanted Maven to be available to every tier, it's like every seller kind of needs access to this stuff. It really takes this whole price taking stuff. It doesn't get rid of it, but it more so uses it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that's one of the biggest advantages of using Maven on your listings is it can recognize, hey, this person's priced underneath me 3 consecutive times. I'm just going to match that price, or I'm just going to stay here. Maybe I'm going to reprice back up. So yeah, Maven does kind of have that basic logic of recognizing price tanking and trying to adjust accordingly in those different scenarios. So yeah, great to hear that one user saw, what'd you say, 63 and then 93? Dollars for sales.
90. Yeah. So basically $30.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the perfect example of Maven just working perfectly as it's designed in that scenario.
Exactly.
But yeah, I'd be curious. One thing that just came to mind, I'm sure others may know, but others may not. I know you mentioned in a scenario, maybe you have X amount of units, a competitor has Y. How do you figure out, or how do you find how much inventory that other person has left?
So it's kind of changed. All the good hacks are gone, I like to say. So back in the day, you had the 999 trick. So essentially what you would do is you would add it to your cart. You would go specifically to their offer, add theirs, and then quantity. It has like the 1, 9, 10, and then it's like 10 plus. If you hit that, it gives you an input field, and you would actually just type 999, enter, and then it would correct you to actually what they do have. So if they had less than 1,000, you would see exactly how many they had. So like the hack used to be with wholesale, you would use like Jungle Scout's estimator for sales volume. You would put all the information in there. You say, okay, well, if 3 of us are competing or selling, and really only 2 of us are competing, if I know I can, the listing itself is going to move on average 20 units a day, and I see that you have 40, I can basically like relinquish my competitiveness and be like, I'm going to give that to you because I'm going to make you sell out. Or what I used to do is actually push people down, pop up, give them the buy box intentionally. Because now you're like, oh, I'm winning. I'm getting sales. Actually, you're getting sales 30% cheaper than what you could have. So I'm going to intentionally do that to like get competitors off listings. So sometimes, again, it is strategic. Sometimes I'm going to intentionally push you down, not because I want sales lower. I want to push you lower, pop up, let you sell out. That's way more like, it makes sense for things like wholesale where you're not managing so many listings, but where you're doing like RA, OA. You just really don't have the time to be doing that. And you're talking, you have 5 units. Like it's irrelevant. But when you have, hundreds, if not thousands of units and something you want to carry for 12 plus months, that's when it's kind of worth being strategic about how do you get competitors off listings by kind of shifting their perspective and making them think that it tanked, when in actuality, we just tanked it on them and like, we're fine, right? You can be very competitive in that way.
Yeah.
So a few questions here. See, Nico, little trouble here. So I joined a free trial today, and it's just said my subscription has ended because I have too many listings. So we don't automatically end your subscription unless, obviously, you get to the end of the trial and there's no payment method added. You don't want to continue. What I would recommend, Nico, just because there could be a lot of things happening here, details matter. Reach out to us in support. So if you're logged into your account, there's that blue button in the bottom right. It should be on this page as well if you're watching this on /office hours. Click there and just reach out, be like, hey, here's exactly what happened. Because we can actually, like Casey or Finn, will actually jump straight into the subscription, the account, and tell you exactly what's happening. But if you just started a subscription today, you should be good. So we definitely want to get that sorted out for you. Rita, good to see you. Hello. Taluanami. I was practicing it in my head, and then I said it, and then I totally ruined it. But it's a pleasure to see you here. Awesome stuff. Let's see. Oh, so we actually have a good question here we can jam on. So right now, my goal is to get more buy box to get sales, because one thing I've noticed is that if I'm not moving enough of a product, it's not that it's not selling. I just don't have the buy box long enough. How do I go about that for battling for the buy box, but not tanking a listing? Casey, you want to hit that first?
Yeah, let me just reread it real quick. I'm making sure I understand it quick. So one thing I noticed is that. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Focusing on the buy box, I know Maven's not specifically designed for that. I typically recommend the buy box targeting strategy for that. Avoiding tanking in that scenario, I would recommend, depending on if you're FBA or FBM or MFN rather, perhaps not necessarily targeting the buy box, or if you are targeting the buy box, having different pricing strategies depending on that specific competition, maybe pricing a little bit differently between whether it's non-prime sellers, FBA sellers. If it is FBA and your FBM, you might want to price a little bit further below them. That may lead to a tanking situation, however. So I would maybe recommend the matching strategy there, kind of matching their price. And that way that would avoid the tanking in that scenario. That's the first place where my mind went to on that, Dylan. How about yourself? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah. It really depends on the situation. So when we look at Maven as an example, you mentioned that it's not designed for maximizing time in the buy box, which sounds kind of odd, but actually it makes sense because it's designed to find the balance between sales velocity and profitability, right? You can maximize your time in the buy box, but actually an increased velocity. But in theory, you're going to have to take a hit on profitability. That's just kind of the way it works in reality. So where my mind goes is on that spectrum, right? On this seesaw, if you will. It could be that you're being too conservative in how you're repricing, in which case Maven actually would work really, really well. And so again, if you're, RA, OA, where, I would say, like, how many units on average of a SKU are you carrying? And then, because if it's like 5 to 10, how often, how much buy box, how much time in the buy box do you really need to sell through? You might find that Maven gets you there plenty of times and still, right? So you're still, moving good velocity, but you're still getting better profitability, which is good, right? Like, you're trying to find that balance of how quickly am I moving and at what profitability, but you can kind of find a nice sweet spot there. However, if you're finding that you're just not getting sales, period, that's when I would go your route. And I would say, again, depending, I would target the buy box as my competition type, and I would start with matching it first. So it's a little bit more conservative outside. Like, we can still do this oscillation thing where once we reach our minimum price, we go to our max price. We can certainly do that. But because you're worried about pushing it down, I would consider matching. But again, it comes down to how many units per SKU are you carrying? Because if you need to move a lot, then I would actually recommend you to lower your price, which sounds counterintuitive, right? Because now we're price tanking. We're really not, right? What we're trying to do is this oscillation, which is a wave that goes up and down. We're increasing sales velocity by lowering our price and being in the buy box more, and then we're popping it back up to our max price to reset the average net profit per unit. What a lot of sellers do, though, is they make this range, your min and your max range, way too wide. Actually, it needs to be very tight. So there's no perfect mathematical way to do it, but the way I tend to recommend thinking about this is, as the price of the buy box increases, so should the range. The reason for that is if we're selling something at $25, if that's where the average buy box is, right? 25 bucks. If I take it from 25 to 24 and then up to 26, so my min is 24, my max is 26, is that realistic? Yes, because we're not pushing it down so much that we're giving up a ton of profitability, but we're also not raising it up so high that people wouldn't follow us, whether that's another repricing tool or the seller themselves, right? It's realistic. Now, $150, is it realistic that somebody may pay you $160? Yeah, absolutely. So what you could do is you could say, well, if the buy box is 150 on average, my max is going to be 160. My minimum is probably going to be like 145. So you see how this increases a little bit, right? So it's only a $5 on the low end, and then on the higher end, it's $10. So that's how I tend to approach manually setting mins and maxes if we're going the oscillation strategy route. Because then again, what we're not doing is we're not tanking it. We're actually taking control of it. And I think that does matter. Now, does it work perfectly? Not necessarily, right? Because we could push it down, pop up, and they could not follow us, right? But I would argue in a lot of cases, that's not bad, because if we're dealing with a lot of sellers that are competitors that have low unit counts per SKU as well, what if I gave you the buy box for 2 days and you sold out? Great. Now I don't have you as a competitor. Now the supply side has changed. And now I can actually take more control of the demand side and actually raise the price up. And right. So like, this is where people get really confused, is like, you think very first order, which is you're pushing the price down. That's bad. What you want to do is think like first, second, and third order. First order is I push it down. Second order is because I did that, I now can actually raise the buy box potentially higher. And funny enough, we did this early on, like the first 6 months of Aura being live, like 2018, where the seller just was like, man, I'm really struggling. The seller is really outcompeting me. We're fighting. I said, okay, well, let's get more in the weeds on this. So what we did is we would have it lower down. The moment it started to lower, I would raise the max price by $1. We'd pop up $1 up. They would follow us, and I would raise the minimum $1 as well, right? So I'm shifting my min max range. And so it's nice. It's like, yeah, we're still competing, but actually what we did is we used repricing and their repricer, the competition's repricer, to actually raise the profitability. So now I'm like, yeah, we're competing, but we're actually making more money as a whole, right? So you have to think about that. And I think that's what's kind of interesting about Maven, right? It has a lot of that like second order kind of perspective where you might see something and be like, oh, is that right? It's like, that wasn't the point. It's the thing that comes after that that really matters, right? Hopefully that makes a lot of sense though, but that's essentially how I would think about this.
Yeah, and generally the way I've been trying to explain it to some folks is if your main goal is sales velocity, then the rules-based buy box targeting strategy is probably going to be your best bet. If you're not as concerned with that sales speed and sales velocity and you want to focus more on that margin, that's where you maybe want to use Maven on those listings where that intelligence of matching price or slightly undercutting folks is going to come into play.
Yeah, when we have users go from pure rule-based to Maven, they're like, well, what can I expect? I go, well, one of three things. Either you were perfectly optimized for that balance, in which case actually not much will change, or, well, I take it back, you'll still see higher prices because you're raising intentionally, Maven does that for you. But some users are really aggressive on the pricing. So you might see a pullback on velocity, like your velocity may slow down because you were too aggressive, but your margin went up. We rebalance, right? So I always I try to get sellers to think when they're switching to Maven, how are you balanced, right? Are you imbalanced on profitability and less on velocity? What's going to happen is less margin, more velocity. That's not a bad thing, right? We're looking at both. Or is it the inverse here, or are we perfectly optimized, which nobody ever is. It's always one or the other. What I tend to see though is a little less in velocity and a lot more in margin. So like you're giving up a little bit of velocity, but that upside of the margin increase is so much greater that it's actually worth like a 10% pullback in velocity, because you're like, yeah, I'm moving less units. I'm moving 10% less units as an example, but my revenue went up like 20%. Right. And my margins are much healthier. Like I'm good. Yeah, that's totally fine. So it just kind of depends on where you're at.
Definitely.
Rita, happy Valentine's Day. It is Valentine's Day. We were just geeking out about everybody's plans in the office with their SOs, making sure we're on top of it. But yes, happy Valentine's Day. So you follow up on what we were just talking about here. So to use the min and max, the prices or the price's space should be slimmer. So if it increases the price up, it will be able to move up. Yeah, exactly. So the upside that really matters here is you really want to think about two scenarios when you raise your price. It's either a repricing tool you're competing with or another seller. So if it's another seller, and let's say you and I are competing, it's just us two, and I go from 25 up to 26, are you going to follow me? Yeah, because that's realistic, right? If I go up to 32, are you going to follow me? Maybe, but that's when we start to get to like a maybe not kind of situation, right? Because it's unrealistic. And that's what's important here. We really want to think about what is realistic versus not realistic. And on the flip side, the other version of this is you're competing with another repricing tool. Everybody has mins and maxes, right? And so if we have ours tighter than theirs, we actually have far more control, because we know that if we raise, most repricing tools are going to say, if I'm winning, but there's somebody higher than me and I'm the lowest price, raise my price. Only in reason, though, only within reason, should I say. So we're essentially taking advantage of others' repricing strategies or seller psychology, which is, if Casey and I are competing, I'm at 25 winning the buy box, but he's at 27. I'm like, why the heck am I at 25? Right? Like, I can own you at 26.99. Great, let's do that. The moment that happens, we restart this whole process, right? So you see how having tighter bounds actually increases performance, where a lot of sellers say, well, I want my max price to be as high as possible. Well, why is that? Well, because if somebody wants to pay me $250 for a $30 item, I want them to be able to. Sounds lovely. The reality is, ain't nobody going to do that, right? Like, and unfortunately, what sellers don't realize is by going so high for this theoretical fantasy that's going to happen, they actually negate the performance increase of having it tighter. And so every time we look at accounts, I'm like, your maxes are too high, lower those by half, because that's more realistic. And this is also why I'm a fan of like manually setting your max prices. If you're going rule based, with Maven, we do this dynamically for you. So it's kind of just like abstracted away. You're just like, I don't need to care about max prices anymore. Because really you shouldn't, right? Min prices have everything to do with you and your buy cost. Max prices have nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with the economics of that listing. And that changes moment by moment, sometimes seconds by seconds, right? New competitors come on, drop off, new supply goes up 200%, goes down 200%. All these things factor in. And so if you're going rule based, which is fine, I would recommend you automatically set your min prices, you ROI, profit margin, fixed profit, because it allows you to have more bulk control. So if you wanted to go from, let's say, 15% ROI to 30% for everything, you change one input, hit save, and it bleeds everywhere else, versus you having to do it for every single SKU. Max prices are different though. So it is better for you to manually set those, because again, if we're automatically doing it based on your costs, that's the only variable being considered. And it's not really as ideal. Happy to hear that. Yeah, we geek out with this stuff, right? Because we've been doing this for 7-8 years at this point, I think. Maybe 6 or 7. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that I think is super important, is like, don't just listen to other sellers, what they're telling you. You should really be listening to the companies with the data, because some things are so counterintuitive, right? You're an Amazon seller, things just don't make sense but work. You're just like, I don't know, but roll with it. And there's so many. That's the hard part about what we do, right? It's because Amazon doesn't say, here's the algorithm, here it is, and like, you go work with it. It's a black box. And so they're going to change things, right? They're going to shift weights where merchant fulfilled is more weighted than FBA during COVID. Great. That nobody told us that. They're not like, hey, by the way, that changed. It's just, you clearly see the pattern. And so being an individual seller, sometimes that's hard to see the pattern because your sample size of data is so small. Whereas for us, thousands upon thousands of users, we're like, yeah, we can see that almost immediately. So yeah, good stuff. Let's see here. So to sell the best use Maven and buy the correct amount to sell monthly. Can you clarify that for me? I just want to make sure we're answering that super clear for you. Let's see, Mohammed. Hey guys, I missed the chat about reduced fee change in Aura. My question is, can I use normal strategy now for those products instead of setting up a 99? So Casey, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe, yes, that's sorted out. So the way we factor that out or factor that in, it's less about if it's Maven or conditional or rule based. Basically, Aura as a whole just understands these are reduced profit ranges. Don't go there. So, obviously Maven can do a lot more with that when it's dynamically setting your max prices. But even if you're automatically setting your mins and maxes using rule based, those are still factored in. So, we might say it's going to be lower than what you would expect because that still technically gives you your 15% minimum ROI, just because we're trying to avoid that that minimum that reduced profit range. Sorry. So yeah.
Yeah, and that I believe that has been updated. If it's not, that will be coming in the next day or so. I know that was on our good friend James's desk specifically to tweak the Maven portion of that logic.
Yeah, exactly. See, Nico, how accurate is the profit calculator / revenue on home tab? The way I try to give this is as accurate as the data you can give us. What I will say though is it's not your true net profit, because we're not factoring in things, where you might say, okay, well, I have $500 a month in software costs. We're not factoring that in, obviously. We're not factoring in refunds right now. That's something we're looking at. So there's some things like it gets you really close. The way I try to position it is like it's really your gross profit based on sales and COGS. That's really what it's designed to be. We're looking at some additional stuff there to make that way more accurate and factor in more things, and obviously give you way more insights, which, stealth mode right now, I'm just going to tease you with it for the moment. But I would say rely on that to really understand your gross profit, and then your net profit really should be in your accounting software, QuickBooks, Xero, what have you. Great question though. Really, really good question. Let's see. Okay. So follow up here. What I mean not overbuying on a product and using Maven is how you get the best moving and selling. Yeah. So basically what we're trying to highlight here is the balance between how much inventory you have and how you're repricing against it. Yeah. So if you buy too much inventory, that's bad. Now, where does this really come into play? Typically wholesale. Sometimes to get it profitable enough, you got to buy 3 months worth of inventory. That's probably fine. But again, when this becomes a problem and when you need to switch over to more velocity from profitability is when you're holding things too long, right? So if okay, I've got 3 months, I know when I'm going to get my long-term storage fees and like that's factored in and we're fine here, that's not an issue. What a lot of people are now going to do though, is they're going to buy 3 months, store some at their prep center or at their warehouse and do weekly shipments in. That way they're keeping the FBA storage fees down. They still have the upfront, discount that they're getting with their supplier or their brand. But yeah, you could definitely like overdo inventory. Like that's always possible. But if you're doing RAOA, unless you're just finding hundreds of units of something, which like, please tell me how, it's probably not going to be a problem for you. But yes, to highlight your point here, it's definitely a combination of inventory, your repricing strategy, and how good and profitable your inventory was when you bought it, right? I think this is so important. Like Casey, this is something we talk about a lot, is like repricing is a multiplication, right? It's an amplification of really good inventory. So if you have horrible inventory and the buy box is always beneath or at your minimum price or at your cost, which I've seen one time, I got nothing for you. Nobody does, right? And so if you buy really good inventory and you get really good at that and you put Aura, Maven, rule-based, it doesn't matter, it's going to do incredibly well because you have the flexibility, right? I think this is what a lot of sellers miss. You're not getting profit when you sell it. You're buying your profit on the front end. So if you buy, bad, you're going to have a bad outcome. But if you buy things where there's tons of margin, it doesn't matter if it gets cut in half because you still have that flexibility. And I think that's what's important too, right? You never want to get stuck with a bunch of inventory that you actually can't move without potentially losing 80% of your starting capital. That's bad. So you got to be a little conservative there. Anything you want to kind of highlight on that, Casey?
No, I mean, I would just double down on the emphasis of intelligent buys are going to lead to the best performance and results. Yep. If you get something at a great price, I know we're talking about avoiding price tanking, but if you get get a great cost per unit, then it does allow you to have that minimum price be lower, which in some cases does lead to more sales, faster moving of inventory and things like that. So yeah, definitely kind of just doubling down on the importance of intelligent buys for your inventories.
Yeah. And little follow up here. So I would actually recommend, and this is something we're pushing a lot of people towards now, is like use actual accounting software. Like your CPA is going to love it. Your tax person is going to love it. It's definitely more work and it's way more, it can feel more overwhelming, but to be honest, like, we're having a lot of user conversations daily and there's a lot of frustrations about just, I don't know how profitable I am. That's a problem, right? But the way you find that is good accounting practices, right? And so I think more sellers need to lean on best practices in business and not use off the shelf tools that are not really accounting software. It's nice when you can see like a high level P&L, right? And like, basic accounting, but that's not the same thing as an entire tool, an entire software cloud designed for that one thing, right? Like, so I would urge you, if you're trying to get like true profitability, if you're trying to get hyper accurate stuff, you need to go look at QuickBooks. You need to get that stuff set up. Now, what's something you have to keep in mind is like the sales you do on Amazon and Seller Central, those are your high level sales, certainly. But really your revenue is what Amazon pays you in reality, right? Because they're taking right. What they're not doing is giving you all of that and then taking the fees out after. They're taking the fees out off the top and then sending you what's left over, right? So like that gets kind of convoluted, but that's why having a really good CPA and accounting firm and bookkeeper just really, really helps. And definitely not my area of expertise. I'm a finance major and like everybody was going to accounting. I'm like, never want to go accounting. Not my strong suit, certainly.
Yeah. That one accounting class I took in college was tough. Not my bag either.
Yeah. That was what's his name? I vaguely remember his name because that was one of the hardest teachers ever. That was rough.
Yeah.
But yeah, good stuff. So John, question about FBM versus FBA. Does Maven have a different way it handles FBM listings against FBA? I have a listing where it seems like it tries to match FBA offers and not compete against lower price FBM. So to answer the question simply, yes, Maven's aware of your offer type and the offer type we're competing against as we're actively competing, right? Just because it's really like, who are we directly competing with at this moment, at this price change, not just everyone, although everyone's factored in. So what it's not going to do is like, and this is why I think it's important to understand that like repricing with Maven is a slightly different perspective. You have to take like, you can't really just come from rule-based or conditional repricing and be like, it just translates one-to-one. It really doesn't. The behaviors are very different. And so it's not just going to say, well, I'm FBM, then therefore target FBM. It's actually going to say, well, again, balance between profitability and sales velocity. Buy box does matter. Like we have the optimal price we're trying to get it to. So all these things are factored in, but the model itself is kind of the same, right? Like what it's attempting to do is the same, but what changes is all the variables that go into the model and then the scenarios it's playing within, if that makes, I know that sounds like so high level and meta, but like, ultimately like the desired outcome of Maven is the same, but the details are very different depending on all the variables at play, your competition, your offer, where are you at, BSR, all these different things basically get factored in. Anything you want to highlight on that, Casey?
No, I would definitely agree. It seems like in this specific scenario, maybe Maven picked up that FBA offer was consistently undercutting you, in which case it would decide to match instead to prevent price tanking there. But other than that, I think pretty much covered everything.
Nice. Mohammed, this is a good one here. I've tried another repricer before and they had a cool feature. The repricer can be set to start auto repricing on newly added products at a set/default ROI or PM or whatever set. Does Aura have something similar? We do. We call it the workflows feature. It's pretty cool. So essentially what you do, and actually, we'll go ahead and create this together because workflows, once you get the hang of it and you understand it, it makes a ton of sense. But a lot of people are just like, how do I get started with this? So I am going to share my screen here. Awesome. Cool. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're just going to create this, and it's actually already here, which is nice, but it's really like two things we need to do. So I'm going to remove this here so we have a little bit more space. Let me free up. There we go. Now we can see everything. So to do that, we click add. We're going to add an event. That event is going to be a new listing, so a newly imported listing. We're going to add that. We're going to hit continue, and then we're going to add two important workflows or actions. First one is going to be setting our strategy. So in our case, we might do Maven. We might just default to Maven default. There we go. And then we're going to enable repricing. So we're going to toggle repricing, enabled, hit add. Now what's going to happen is whenever a newly imported listing, comes into your account, we're going to set the strategy to main default, and we're going to enable repricing. The only thing that we haven't done here is added our costs, right? So we're making the assumption, which is true in this case, that Maven is automatically setting our mins based on ROI. So in your case, let's say 15, 20% ROI, whatever makes sense. That's automatically going to happen, but we still need the cost, right? So if you're using an integration, that's automatically going to get pulled in. Or if you add it manually, use uploads, there's a few different routes you can take, obviously, to get your costs in here. But yeah, so you can definitely put that on autopilot, which is pretty cool. We tried to think about what are the tasks still left for you to do, like the logistical, operational kind of things where it needs to get done. It's important, but code can do that for you really easily and obviously immediately versus you being like, oh, tomorrow morning, I need to remember to do this. It's like, or just let it do it itself, right? Like, so Workflows is designed for that. Workflows is pretty cool because we built it in such a way that it's a bunch of Lego pieces, right? It's like, there's no one way to use it, although the way we just showed you, which is what you're asking, is like probably the most useful, like first workflow that everybody has, right? Just put it on autopilot. But there's other things you can do, right? You can pause repricing. You can take it to your max every 3 hours, right? Some people call this the yo-yo strategy. Basically, they're like reprice, but once an hour, once every 3 hours for 10, 20 minutes, take me to my max price or the buy box price plus 40%. And then let it sit there for 10 minutes and let's kind of go again. So good stuff.
And one thing to note there, Dylan, just with the limits on listings for Maven, I wouldn't necessarily recommend having Maven as your default strategy because you may run into, oh, you're already at your limit. Then that listing is going to be in there without a strategy. So as long as you're keeping an eye on your listings limit for Maven and how many listings you have in there, feel free to use Maven, but just a note there in case you're really right on that threshold there.
Yeah. Good call out. The good thing to do is understand what subscription level are you on? How many listings do you have relative to Maven? If let's say you want to default to Maven, if you have 500 Maven listings available and you have 300 listings, you could probably be fine for a little while, but eventually, if you're scaling super fast, it's a great point. You definitely want to be aware of that. See, John, makes perfect sense. Thank you, gentlemen, for clarifying. I'm loving Maven so far, winning me over other repricers in the market. Happy to hear that. And inventory age workflow to lower my minimums automatically would make me a lifetime user. Yeah. So, we were talking about age of inventory yesterday. So age of inventory is fantastic. There's a few different ways we're internally thinking about this, right? Workflows, I think makes a ton of sense there, where what we would probably do instead of saying a workflow, which would say if my age of inventory is less than whatever in X, whatever, then change my mins. What we would probably do is say if age of inventory is greater than 60 days, change my strategy from strategy A to strategy B. And what's nice is strategy A could be setting your mins at 30% ROI. Strategy B could be setting it at 15% ROI, right? So we can kind of have this. And what's nice is it's very shared, right? Like we have these assets that we can repurpose however we need. And then another way is, if you're using Maven, this is something we're really thinking about is like, how do we factor in age of inventory into Maven, right? Is that, and this is just, how we're thinking right now. There's no like definitive answer quite yet, but it could be that there's a very clear way to do it that works across the board and it's just baked into the model, or it could be configurable, right? You could say, hey, if age of inventory is greater than 60, I want you to be more aggressive. And we go, okay, cool, we'll do that. Or you can say, I don't care about age of inventory. Like I never hit that problem. Don't even think about it. So we are thinking about that. I like the idea of adding it to Maven because it makes Maven like in an ideal state, you don't have a bunch of stuff, right? You have a few things, like a few strategies, a few workflows that are the most impactful things, but we're not adding more complexity, right? So it's nice is like by doing that inside of Maven, we don't need to have multiple strategies. We could just have the one, and you just say, hey, when this happens, you just do that for me. And when it changes, you also do that for me. Because if we go the workflows route, like what immediately comes to my mind is that's a one-way street, right? So if you say if age of inventory is greater than 60, go to strategy B. What happens when the age of inventory for that same SKU goes beneath 60 days? Nothing. Unless you create a second workflow that says if it's beneath this, then go there, right? So workflows can get really complicated. And I think that's something to highlight. It's like you could do a lot of cool stuff, but you really got to think it through. Whereas for us, we really want to build things and add features and configurations and functionality that kind of helps you still get the end outcome you want without there being that added complexity. I think this is where a lot of repricing tools and really just software in the Amazon space fail. They go, oh yeah, here's all the things you asked for. And it's like, great. You just increase the complexity by like 10X. like, and now what's tough is you do the thing that rationally makes sense to you, which is say, go from A to B if age of inventory is greater than 60, but you may fail to realize you need to do the inverse too. But guess what? The inverse also has its own pitfalls, right? And so you have to kind of think like a programmer to a certain degree, with that level of complexity. So I think adding it to Maven would probably make the most impact, but adding it as a workflow still would be, I think, great because it's giving you that flexibility if you want it to be really hyper, like I really want it this way. But Maven would be really cool to do that on, where you just say, here's my breakpoint, because most people have the same breakpoint, right? At the beginning of the call, we're talking about price tanking and seller psychology, inventory life cycles, right? You're more conservative when you first come in stock, and you're more aggressive when you're kind of coming up to long-term storage fees. Most people that I've talked to, most users are like at day 30 or at day 45 or at day 60 or at day 90. That's when I say things need to change. Great. Just do that, right? So now you don't need multiple strategies. You don't need multiple workflows. You just basically have a more extensible model, which is Maven, that just handles all that complexity for you.
Yeah. Anything that will make Maven smarter, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the whole thing, right? It's like, how do we take all these things? We're like, oh, I wish we do that. And it's like, just let Maven do that. That I think that's the point here is like, let Maven handle far more for you without adding the complexities that you have to now deal with. So super important. Let's see. Mohammed, you're welcome. Yeah, workflows are really cool. Definitely play around with that. Speaking of code capabilities, here's a request. Can feature or merge different cogs for the same ASIN and set an average bypassing IL imported data? Let me think about that here. Or merge different cogs for the same ASIN and set an average bypassing. Okay, so there's a few routes I want to take this. Because you mentioned ASIN specifically, we look at the SKU. So if we're assuming by ASIN, you mean you have multiple SKUs, and then we could just say, great, you have 3 SKUs of that same ASIN. We already have 2 costs. Let's just average those and apply it to all or to the third. That's its own kind of thing versus do we want to take different input sources as costs, as your COGS, and then average those? That's kind of different. So clarify that for me in the comment section, because I want to make sure we hit that. There's just a few different variables or scenarios there. That's super, super important. Let's see. See, Julie, my free trial is up tomorrow, guys, and I have a couple of other free trials I want to try out to maximize the amount of time I have without paying while trying to figure out which one works best for our business. I love Aura. It's definitely won me over, especially with the customer support. Appreciate that. We try to really lean into that. From Casey, this man right here, highlight big ups. I will continue to follow this podcast, and I hope to be back soon. Thanks, guys. P.S. I really enjoy the easy use setup and the dashboard features. Great job. We really appreciate that. Julie, if you feel like you need extra time, please reach out to Casey via support. We like to work with our users, right? Sometimes 14 days is plenty for a trial. Other times you're like, I got really busy. And like, totally get it. We're not sticklers really for much. So listen, if you're like, hey, I started a trial and I just wasn't able to like get the most out of it because time constraints or whatever, let us know. We're so happy to reset these kind of things within reason. Obviously, we're not just gonna like give you like a 2-month free trial, but if you're like, hey, like I just really didn't have time, yeah, we got you covered. We could do this stuff super easy for you guys. So we definitely want to make sure you feel supported, and I'm glad to hear you've had a great experience with us so far. And if you haven't, Julie, we offer one-on-one onboarding sessions. So if you really want to make the most out of it, what I would probably recommend, let's reset your trial, kind of start over, schedule an onboarding this week or next week with Finn. And let's really take you from like, this was a good experience to like, I really know the ins and outs of this. And I'm getting the max performance that I can from Aura, because I think that's super important. That's something we really try to push users to do in our onboarding flow. If we see you're struggling via the data, we'll actually recommend like, hey, schedule time. We want to talk with you. We want you to succeed here. We're so super accessible here. So definitely take advantage of that if you haven't. So, okay. So awesome. Had an onboarding scheduled tomorrow for my last day. So Julie, what we're going to do here, I'm going to ping Finn and just let him know in that, let's go ahead and get your reset. So we'll take care of you there. You won't have to do anything. We'll do that for you on the back end. So not worried there. See, John, I'd be happy with a workflow that switched the strategy to even rule-based for inventory age. But if you guys could do it with Maven, that would be so sick. I agree. Super excited for how you geniuses implement this. Appreciate that. I think a lot of times we definitely don't feel that way. I think a lot of times we feel like we're hitting our heads up against a brick wall, but I think that's part of figuring things out, right? Trying to innovate, trying to think differently. Sometimes you have something that rationally just makes total sense to you, and then you go to implement, you're like, actually we missed one obvious thing. What the heck are we doing? But welcome to being a startup, being a founder, being on the team of a startup. It's like trying a bunch of stuff. Like Hyperdrive is such a great example where like, oh, that's kind of interesting, and then all of a sudden we're like, oh no, this is huge. Like this is actually way bigger than we thought it was. And even the all offers, page when you're on a listing, if you click on it, we'll show you all the current offers. It's like, oh, that's kind of nice. When we started to migrate people to the beta for 1.0, I personally did a lot of these onboarding and migration sessions, and I would, walk you through the app. Here's what's changed, blah, blah, blah. I have my flow. Like, oh yeah, go ahead and click there. So that way, you know where it's at. And every person was like, wait a second, don't skim over that. Hold on. That's huge. Like I can source from that list actually. I'm like, oh yeah. Didn't even think about that. It makes a ton of sense. So like you even have little things. You're like, oh, it's kind of cool. It's a nice to have. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's actually massive. So, you have both of everything in between and on that spectrum we experience. So, but definitely appreciate it. Yeah. Maven is something that we want to continue to extend. Again, without adding more complexity, right? This is why, we recently added a few configurations, not really settings. It's really just, by default, it's going to work the best, but sometimes, like as an example, it will auto unsuppress buy boxes for you. But what if you don't want that to happen? Okay, cool. Uncheck it. Now it just knows not to do that for you, right? And so what you don't have to do is understand all these new settings and configurations. It's so clear that's like, do you want us to do that for you or not? Not how and all these things and build the algorithm. It's just yes or no. You go, yes, perfect. Like, Maven's designed so that like, you can set one setting, which is your min, calculation, right? Min, ROI, profit margin, fixed profit, what have you. And you can do that one thing. Everything else by default is, in our opinion, the best to start with. Hit go. You can understand nothing and still do incredibly well, right? Like I don't want you to feel like how I felt when I first got into repricing as a seller, which is like, I now have to become an expert at this. I don't want you to do that. It's not really exciting. Casey had to do that when he first came on board. It's like, great, get ready. And like to speak to that too, Casey, because you haven't been with us too long, but you've kind of gone from this as an industry to really having to understand and support sellers and building good strategies and finding red flags and all these good things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been really helpful being the main person in the support chat for you folks, having all your different scenarios come through and having those back and forth, really trying to understand what your specific setup is, how it may differ from typical recommendations and things like that. So I do have to thank our customers for the quick learning curve and getting me up to speed partially. But yeah, it makes it really easy to kind of look at the data. I know we're always talking about data is available and unlocking it, being able to use it intelligently. So just being able to look at data of some of our more successful sellers and then try to replicate that, whether it's with the same strategies, slight tweaks depending on FBA, FBM, whatever the specific
Yeah.
scenario may be, and really just kind of diving into the deep end of the pool and sinking, not swimming. So yeah, it's a very interesting space, and I know a lot of you folks have very specific situations and setups that you're dealing with. So always feel free to reach out with those questions, and as much context as you can provide, that'll help us give you the best advice for hopefully the best results as well.
Yeah, exactly. I always brag when we're doing like podcast interviews, which I'm doing one right after this, right? So it's very top of mind. But I like to brag on our success team, because I'm like, you can literally just message us with a SKU and be like, it feels wrong, and say nothing else, and we could take a look and be like, I know why you think that, and that's correct, or that's incorrect, and here's why. And I think this is something we talked about when you first joined, Casey, is like, there's really like 6 to 8 patterns, right? You do this long enough and at a high enough scale like we do, that you're like, it's one of these, like even just the language that a user will use when they come in, you're like, it's one of these 2 or 3 things, and then you just go verify which one. You're like, oh, this is exactly what it is, right? And you get so good that eventually you're like, oh, it's probably just this one thing. Let me just go ahead and verify it. And you're like, oh, that's exactly what it is. So like when people are like, how are you guys moving so fast? How are you responding so fast? Well, it's because we have really good pattern recognition, and we're able to very quickly see it's just that, because I already had the hunch, and like, here we go. Here's the solution, right? So even starting with hardly any data, we can still help out relatively fast, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to brag on you guys a bit more here. Like, Casey and Finn have very clear KPIs weekly. We check these on Mondays during our one-on-ones, one-on-one sessions. And I look at 2 very important things: speed and quality, right? So speed is a median first response time during business hours, right? We want that to be less than 10 minutes. So the middle, you're going to, 10 minutes. Tend to hit less than 6 minutes, actually. Now, speed sounds nice, but you can hack that, right? You could just jump in and be like, hey. All of a sudden, like, you got great numbers, but is that really good support? No. So the quality measurement, we look at something called a CSAT, which is a customer satisfaction rating. So if you ever interact with support, once that ticket is closed, the conversation is done, we'll say, hey, give us a feedback here. Was it great? Was it okay? Poor, horrible, right? Like, we have this whole spectrum, and we look at this every single Monday. It's like, there's anything less than basically great, we dive into the conversation and say, how could we have done this better? So the benchmark there, the KPI is 95%. Customer satisfaction rating, we tend to hit 98 on the low end, really like 100% on average. Mm-hmm. So it's like, we can get you, support really fast with really high quality. Like that, and that takes a lot. That took a lot for us to develop and understand, how do we even remotely do that at scale like we do? Because we are a small team, and we don't outsource anything. We don't outsource, tech. We don't outsource engineering, code, none of that. We don't outsource any of the support or success roles. It's literally like Casey in here, just like bleeding from his eyeballs, making it happen. So it's not that bad, but it's a little daunting, I think, too, when you're like, oh, like, you're going to support like this many thousands upon thousands of users. How the heck are we going to do that? And they're like, oh, okay, like, this actually makes sense. We design it in such a way that it's very scalable. So, some people can come in, never talk to us in support, get completely supported with proactive stuff, emails, chats that we're sending out automatically based on their behaviors. Never talk to us, be with us for 5-something years. And then other people, they come in day one, they're like, I need hand-holding. Got you. Right? Like, no questions asked. We got you covered. So no matter like how much or to what level of support you need, we can kind of tailor that to you, which is pretty nice. So starting to wrap up here for time, but any additional questions, happy to dive into anything. Obviously Aura product related, repricing generally, as well as just, seller stuff, right? Like seller lifestyle, I think should be a thing. How like every industry has like lifestyle marketing. We should have seller, right? There should be there should be a clothing line for sellers. I'm not sure how cool it would look, but it'd be kind of interesting.
Well, we've got a jump start on that with our Aura t-shirts and whatnot.
Yeah. Well, I got the special one on right now. I usually have the big Aura one. This is the special one. But yeah, it's funny. Everybody's been emailing me asking for shirts. So I've been sending some out. They're definitely cool. I'm not gonna lie. They're pretty slick. I basically wear them, depending on the day, I might just wear like a plain black tee, but at this point, I'm like every day I have some kind of public facing thing. So I'm like, I just wear that every day.
Yeah.
I actually ran out, which is why I had to wear this one today, but I kind of like these a lot too. Very subtle.
Yeah.
So yeah, so we'll give a few more minutes here before we officially wrap up, but definitely appreciate everybody, joining us this week. We got to dive into a lot of interesting things, spanning from price tanking to workflows, to Maven and the future of Maven and a bunch of age of inventory and stuff like that. So yeah, see, John, how did you come up with the Aura logo? So we actually worked with the team. So when we did the rebrand, we didn't just look at the logo. We actually we went through a whole process. We really wanted to make sure that we're highlighting us as a company because we have our own culture and values and stuff like that. And also like, how does the brand feel, right? Because what we do is very technical, but at the same time, it's very humanistic, right? Like repricing is very technical, but the way we support and communicate with our users is not. It's very, casual and yeah, humanistic, right? Very personable. So we wanted to find that balance there. And so when we looked at us as a brand, we looked at colors, we looked at topography, right? Like everything. And we wanted that to blend in really well with Aura, the product too, right? That synergy there. And, one of the things we realized is a lot of Amazon software uses the same orange and they use seller in the name, or AMZ is the old version of that. And it's so very clear that you're an Amazon software. To be honest, we don't really want to fit that stereotype. We're trying to break stereotypes, right? We really want to say, no, we're a tech company, and this is the type of products we create. This is our standard. This is how we measure quality, and we want the brand to reflect that very well. So there's a lot that went into that for sure. We really iterated on probably 10 plus versions that we liked and went through. But yeah, it was a I don't know, probably a month and a half, 2 month ordeal. Hate to call it an ordeal. That sounds negative, but like process. But it was great. You come out of that process being like, great. We feel like, the brand really reflects who we are, where we're going now. And something like you just want to wear, it's like, you just like start to identify with the brand being on the team. So, yeah, that's a long-winded answer, but basically to say there's a lot that went into it. It was very thought through is what I will say. There wasn't like, we just did this one thing. Like that's how we got it. I like the whole chat GPT, AI logo makers. I played around with them a few times. I'm like, they're just never good. I don't get it, man. So we went with a very manual process. So see, last one here, we'll wrap up. Benji, is it possible to add a shipping cost on FBM items? Casey, you want to hit that?
Yeah, absolutely, Benji. Yeah. So for any FBM items that you're selling, you want to add that shipping cost into the cost field. As of right now, we don't have an additional shipping field within Aura, though that has been discussed. I know that's been a requested feature as well. Not sure where that may be on our roadmap or if it's planned at all yet. But for now, you'll definitely want to add those shipping fees and costs into the cost field so Aura can take those into account rather.
Only thing to keep in mind there, if you are doing that, you cannot use the Inventory Lab integration at the same time because it will be overridden. So just keep that in mind. Depending on if you're already using it, that's something to consider. If you're not using it, then it's a non-issue for you. If you are using it and that creates some problems, what I tend to recommend is basically say like, look at your inventory, look at the data and say, okay, well, my average, FBM shipping cost is X, and, that would increase my minimum by 5% ROI. Great. So if you're setting your mins at 15% ROI, crank it up to 20%. That way it's kind of factored in without being factored in, if that makes sense. Like we're averaging here, right? It's not like hyper precise, but it gets you really close if you still want to be able to use that integration. So that's like the two ways I would essentially approach that. So yeah. Cool. Awesome. Casey, this was a good one, man. I feel like we're getting into a good groove here. We're talking about a lot of good stuff. So yeah, again, we're doing this every Wednesday, 2 p.m. EST to 3 p.m. EST. It's a way for us to be able to jump in, have really direct conversations with users at scale. If you ever have questions or need help, you can either reach out to us in support. You can obviously email me directly, Dylan@goaura.com. We're always available, always happy to help. Also, I like to highlight this because I think it's awesome. Aura works on your phone very well. Like go ahead and log in on your browser, log into your account, the dashboard, add it to your home screen. Now it's a mobile app. Everybody's on the run. Everybody's on the go. but it makes it super enjoyable and super flexible to be able to do it, kind of reprice whenever, right? You know, you're at football practice, awesome. You need to change your strategy, do it on the fly. There you go. But Casey, any last words from your end?
Yeah, thanks to the crowd today for some good questions. And yeah, I know we've been kind of starting the last few office hours with kind of a main subject for the first 10, 15 minutes. So if you do have any subjects or topics you'd like us to cover, feel free to ping me in the chat. I can make a note for the upcoming office hours. And we hope to see you next week, folks.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Adios.